The cold winds of 1513 howled through the corridors of the Topkapi Palace, their whispers carrying the echoes of a fallen prince. The imperial courtiers moved in silence, careful not to meet the gaze of the woman standing by the window. Nigar Hatun, once a cherished consort of Bayezid II, now stood alone, her frail hands gripping the silk of her dress as she watched the Bosphorus shimmer under the pale moonlight. The waters below had carried news of conquest, betrayal, and bloodshed for decades. Tonight, they would bring only one message: the fate of her son. She had spent years in the heart of power, witnessing the rise and fall of sultans, the silent wars waged within the harem, and the brutal contest for the throne that devoured sons before their time. Şehzade Korkut, her beloved child, had once been a prince full of promise, a scholar with a mind sharper than any blade. He had sought wisdom where others sought war, diplomacy where others thirsted for blood. But in the Ottoman Empire, mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and weakness had no place in the House of Osman. Word had already spread of Selim's triumph. The new sultan had secured his throne by eliminating all rivals. One by one, his brothers had fallen to the bowstring, their deaths ensuring that no challenge would rise against him. Korkut had been the last. The only question left unanswered was whether he still breathed or if, like so many before him, he had already been reduced to a lifeless form in the shadows of the empire. As the scent of burning incense filled the chamber, memories clawed their way back into Nigar Hatun's mind. She had once believed that power, influence, and cunning would be enough to secure her son's future. She had played the game as best she could, whispering in the ears of viziers, forming alliances in the harem, and guiding Korkut with all the wisdom she possessed. But had it ever truly been enough? Tonight, she would find out, for in the palace of the sultan, where fate was measured by the sharp edge of ambition, a mother's prayers were rarely answered. The imperial harem of Topkapi Palace was a world of its own, a place where whispers carried more weight than swords, where ambition could be as deadly as poison. It was here, within these gilded walls, that Nigar Hatun's fate was sealed. She had arrived in the Ottoman court as so many others had before her. A young woman from a distant land, caught in the endless tide of power that shaped empires. Some said she was of noble lineage, perhaps a daughter of an Anatolian governor or a Circassian beauty taken from the Caucasus. Others whispered that she was a gift from the Venetian traders, a token of diplomacy wrapped in silk. What was certain was that she was chosen. The harem was more than a prison, it was a battlefield of whispers and alliances, where only the strongest, the most cunning, and the most beautiful survived. Under the ever-watchful eyes of the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan Mehmed II, young women were trained in the arts of seduction, poetry, music, and political intrigue. It was not enough to be beautiful, beauty was common in the harem. To rise above the hundreds of other women, one had to be exceptional. And Nigar was exceptional. From the moment she stepped into the harem, she learned quickly. She listened to the older concubines, studying how they spoke, how they moved, how they played their roles. She understood that power in the harem did not belong to the women who simply pleased the sultan. It belonged to those who could influence him. The Valide Sultan had control over the harem, but the concubine who bore a son held the future of the empire in her hands. It was not long before her beauty and intelligence caught the attention of Prince Bayezid, the favored son of Sultan Mehmed II. Bayezid was not like his father, where Mehmed II was ruthless, a warrior who conquered Constantinople and reshaped the world. Bayezid was gentler, more pious, a man of books and contemplation. He was a thinker, a dreamer, a man who sought peace where his father saw war. He was drawn to Nigar not just for her beauty, but for her mind. In a world where men ruled and women were often silenced, Nigar dared to speak, and Bayezid listened. Their nights together were filled with philosophy, poetry, and quiet dreams of a different kind of empire. She whispered to him about governance, about justice, about how a ruler should not only be feared but also loved. She spoke of the suffering of the common people, the dangers of endless war, the need for a ruler who could bring balance rather than destruction. It was not long before she bore him a son, Şehzade Korkut was born under an auspicious moon. His arrival celebrated with feasts and prayers. In the Ottoman Empire, a prince's birth was not just the joy of a father, it was a political event. A sign that the bloodline remained strong, that the future of the empire was secure. But with that joy came danger. For every son born in the harem, a deadly game began. Nigar knew that her son was both a blessing and a curse. He was now a contender for the throne, whether he wanted to be or not. She had seen what happened to princes who were too weak to claim their birthright, they were eliminated. She had seen the eyes of other concubines, the subtle shifts in power whenever a new heir was born. She knew that the moment Korkut entered the world, she had to fight for his survival. The first challenge was ensuring Bayezid's favor. The prince had many concubines, and while he favored Nigar now, affection was fickle in the imperial court. She had to remain indispensable. She had to be more than just a lover, she had to be a counselor, a confidant, a force behind his future throne. The second challenge was the harem itself. There were whispers that other women sought to undermine her, that they would do anything to ensure that their sons, not Korkut, would inherit the empire. Poison was a common weapon in the palace, and many a promising prince had met his end in the cradle before he could even utter his first words. Nigar did not trust the wet nurses assigned to Korkut. She oversaw every aspect of his care, ensuring that no hands but hers prepared his meals, that no one but the most loyal attendants came near him. When she saw an unfamiliar servant near Korkut's chambers one night, she had the woman removed without hesitation. But survival was not just about protection, it was about strategy. Bayezid's father, Sultan Mehmed II, was still alive, and the question of succession loomed over the empire. Mehmed was a legend, the conqueror of Constantinople, a ruler whose name was feared across Europe and Asia. But even legends must die. And when he did, his sons would have to fight for his throne. Nigar knew that when that time came, she had to ensure that Bayezid would be the one to claim the title of sultan. For if he did, Korkut's future would be safe. She began forging alliances in the palace, using every favor, every whispered word, every carefully placed conversation to build support for Bayezid. She strengthened ties with viziers, won the loyalty of key eunuchs, and ensured that the religious scholars spoke favorably of her prince. The battle for the throne was coming. And in the shadows, where the real power lay, Nigar Hatun was ready. The year was 1481, and the Ottoman Empire, under the rule of Sultan Mehmed II, stood at its zenith. The city of Constantinople, once the heart of the Byzantine Empire, now belonged to the Ottomans, marking an unparalleled achievement in world history. The legacy of Mehmed the Conqueror was etched into the very fabric of the empire. A warrior sultan whose name commanded fear and respect across continents. But as the sultan grew older, the question of succession began to stir among his sons. For Mehmed II had many children, and the struggle for the throne was already being set in motion. Bayezid II, the second son of Sultan Mehmed, was different from his father. Where Mehmed had waged relentless war and expanded the empire's borders with a strategic mind and military might, Bayezid had inherited a mind more inclined toward peace and governance. His thoughts were often far removed from the battlefield, focused instead on strengthening the empire from within, preserving its stability and prosperity, and promoting a sense of inclusiveness among his subjects. Bayezid's reign was marked by a striking contrast to his father's conquests. While Sultan Mehmed had conquered lands far and wide, Bayezid sought to preserve the empire, preferring diplomacy and strategic alliances over military expansion. His diplomatic policies were rooted in his belief that a ruler should not strive to conquer the world at the expense of internal stability, but rather, he believed in fostering harmony within the empire's vast borders. This often put him at odds with other princes, whose views on the future of the empire were more aggressive. However, Bayezid's approach was not without its critics. His soft touch, his preference for peaceful solutions, was seen by some as weak and indecisive. Sultan Jem, his younger brother, challenged his authority with open rebellion. A bitter rivalry had been brewing between Bayezid and Jem, each vying for the support of the powerful factions within the empire. each claiming to be the better heir to the throne. Nigar Hatun, whose bond with Bayezid had deepened over the years, was keenly aware of the tensions brewing. She knew that with Jem's challenge growing, Bayezid's rule was not secure. But she also knew that her husband was no mere warrior, he was a man of wisdom, more inclined to seek peaceful resolution than to spill blood. This was why she had made her decision long before Bayezid even realized the dangers looming on the horizon. She had to ensure her son, Korkut, was placed in a position of power. As Bayezid continued to strengthen his position through diplomacy, Nigar's political acumen proved invaluable. Her ability to read the room, to sense the shifting allegiances of the court, became a crucial asset for her husband. She was not a woman of mere beauty, she was a silent force. A strategic thinker, who knew when to speak and when to remain silent. Despite their differences, Nigar was deeply devoted to Bayezid. She believed in his vision for the empire, even as she understood the dangerous game of succession being played by her husband's own flesh and blood. Bayezid's love for her was genuine, though it was tempered by the complex nature of the Ottoman court. His affection for Nigar had never been solely about her physical beauty. He saw in her a kindred spirit, someone who understood the delicate balance of power, someone who could help him rule in a way that brought peace to his subjects. In the imperial harem, the constant intrigues and betrayals weighed heavily on Nigar. She could see the undercurrents of tension, the shifting allegiances, the subtle movements of rival women plotting against her. The birth of Şehzade Korkut, while a blessing, also marked the beginning of a new phase in her life. As soon as her son was born, she knew that the stakes were much higher. Korkut was now a possible heir, and she had to ensure that his future was protected, no matter the cost. The birth of Korkut was a turning point for Nigar. She had seen how the palace reacted to the birth of every heir. The other concubines looked at her with envy, even disdain. But Nigar knew that Korkut's place in the royal line was not just about his birthright. It was about securing the future of her family. She had to act swiftly, aligning herself with those who would be most likely to support Bayezid's rule. But the rivalry between Bayezid and Jem was not easily quelled. Jem, with his ambitious and more warlike nature, continued to garner support among the more aggressive factions in the empire. Nigar knew that Jem's rebellion could destabilize everything they had worked for, including the safety of Korkut. The stakes were not just about who would sit on the throne, they were about the survival of her son. Bayezid's reign saw a period of relative peace, but this peace came at a cost. As Jem's rebellion spread, Bayezid faced the difficult task of putting down the insurrection while maintaining his careful balance between diplomacy and military action. The empire was on the brink, and Nigar Hatun, ever the silent strategist, knew that she had to keep her husband's mind focused on the long-term goal, peace and stability, while also protecting her son from the dangerous politics of the court. As the Ottoman Empire continued its march into the future, Nigar's role in the palace became increasingly clear. She was not just Bayezid's wife, she was his most trusted advisor. A woman who had her finger on the pulse of the empire, who could read the shifting tides of politics and alliance. Her love for Bayezid was unwavering, but she also knew that her primary duty now was to ensure Korkut's future, even if it meant navigating the dangerous waters of the Ottoman court. With each passing year, Bayezid's rule grew more precarious. The empire was changing, and so were the dynamics within the palace. As Nigar continued to secure alliances and fortify her son's position, she could feel the inevitable storm approaching. The winds of succession were about to stir once again, and the battle for the throne would soon become a matter of life and death for those in the royal family. Nigar Hatun, who had once entered the harem as a mere concubine, now stood at the center of the empire's future, a woman who would stop at nothing to protect her son, even if it meant playing a dangerous game of power, loyalty, and survival. As the years passed, the challenges facing Bayezid II only grew more formidable. His reign, while relatively peaceful compared to his father's, was not without its trials. His inclination toward diplomacy and reconciliation had earned him both praise and scorn. Many within the empire, particularly those who had risen through the ranks during his father's reign, believed that Bayezid was too gentle for the ruthless politics of the Ottoman court. Yet, Despite these whispers, he had maintained control over the empire, thanks in no small part to the guidance of Nigar Hatun, his most trusted advisor. But even Nigar could not ignore the growing tensions. The rivalries within the imperial family were becoming more pronounced, and the throne of the Sultan was no longer a distant thought for Bayezid's sons, it was within reach. In particular, the position of Şehzade Korkut, her own son, had become increasingly precarious. He had grown into a fine young man, well-educated and deeply philosophical, a stark contrast to his brothers, who seemed more inclined toward the military prowess and power struggles that characterized the world of the Ottoman court. Korkut's heart was not in war, and it was this very difference that worried Nigar. He had inherited his father's love for peace and intellectual pursuits, a mind that sought to govern with wisdom rather than through strength. Nigar knew that while Korkut's qualities made him an admirable person, they also left him vulnerable in a world where the throne was claimed by blood, not by virtue. To survive in this world, Korkut had to adapt. He had to embrace the politics of the palace. But even as Nigar worked tirelessly to strengthen Korkut's position, she could not ignore the rise of Selim, the youngest of Bayezid's sons. Unlike Korkut, Selim had inherited a more ruthless nature. He was ambitious, fiercely determined, and utterly willing to do whatever it took to secure his future. Bayezid had never been fond of war, but Selim was different. He believed in action, in proving his worth through military conquest. He gathered around him a loyal following, including powerful generals and military leaders who viewed him as the future sultan. Selim's rise was a dangerous prospect for Korkut, who, despite his popularity with the intellectuals and scholars of the empire, lacked the raw ambition that his younger brother possessed. Nigar could feel the tension building in the palace. Selim was gaining influence, and Korkut, in his quiet study of philosophy and governance, was becoming a threat to no one. It was during this time that Nigar Hatun began to make strategic alliances within the court. She sought out those who could provide Korkut with the necessary backing. Those who believed in a ruler who would prioritize the welfare of the people over the thirst for conquest. Nigar knew that it was not enough for Korkut to be a scholar. He had to prove his worth in the cutthroat world of Ottoman politics. The harem, where the intrigues of the court unfolded in whispers, became Nigar's battlefield. The women of the harem, the other concubines, the ladies-in-waiting, the eunuchs, were all players in the great game of succession. Nigar's charm, her intellect, and her ability to read people gave her an edge. She had already secured alliances with some of the most influential women in the palace, including the powerful Valide Sultan, Bayezid's mother. The Valide Sultan, who had witnessed the political machinations of previous reigns, was a shrewd and capable woman. She understood the stakes better than anyone, and her support for Korkut was invaluable. But Nigar knew that while the Valide Sultan's backing was essential, it would not be enough. Korkut's ability to command loyalty among the people and the military was what would ultimately determine his success or failure. And so, she turned her attention to those who controlled the army and the provincial governors. She met in secret with key military figures, offering them promises of influence and favor in exchange for their support for Korkut's claim to the throne. At the same time, she began to distance herself from Selim's growing circle. Nigar had no love for her younger son's ambition, and although she had been careful not to show her disdain, it was clear to those who were watching that she was loyal to Korkut. This, she knew, would make her a target in the power struggle to come. As Bayezid's health began to decline, the sense of impending crisis grew stronger. The Sultan, ever the diplomat, had tried to hold together a vast empire with delicate balance, but the weight of his years had caught up with him. He was often bedridden, his mind clouded by illness, and the once mighty Sultan was no longer the decisive figure he had once been. In his absence, the political factions in the court began to grow bolder. The death of Sultan Mehmed II, Bayezid's father, had set the stage for an even more fierce contest for power. The legacy of Mehmed the Conqueror had cast a long shadow over his sons, and the looming question of succession was no longer just a matter of royal intrigue, it was a matter of life and death. Bayezid's sons were now entering the fray, each with their own claims to the throne, each with their own vision for the future of the empire. Nigar Hatun watched as her son, Şehzade Korkut, was sent to Manisa to govern, a position that was as much about safeguarding the future as it was about keeping him out of the capital's political battles. There, Korkut flourished in the relative peace of the province, cultivating his knowledge of governance and administration. His mind, sharp and contemplative, turned more toward justice and reform than military conquest. But the distance from the court, while keeping him safe, also isolated him from the intrigue that was bubbling up in the capital. The game of succession was fast approaching its dangerous climax. Selim, with his military prowess and thirst for power, was poised to challenge his father. But Nigar knew that Bayezid's illness and Selim's ambition would force the inevitable confrontation between the brothers. The palace, once a place of peace, had turned into a field of battle, and for Nigar, the stakes could not have been higher. The survival of her son, Korkut, depended on the delicate web of alliances she had woven within the palace walls. Yet as the political winds shifted and her son's future seemed more uncertain than ever, Nigar Hatun knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would stop at nothing to protect Korkut's future, even if it meant betraying her own flesh and blood. The quiet murmur of the palace was now thick with tension. Sultan Bayezid II, once a man of reason and deliberation, had fallen into a rapid decline, both physically and mentally. His days of governance were over. The great sultan who had once held the empire together with his careful diplomacy and peaceful approach to rule was now a shadow of himself. His mind clouded by age and illness, the once powerful ruler of the Ottoman world had become a silent figure, unable to stop the growing storm that raged within his court. Bayezid's health had begun to fail him years before, but it was only now, in his final days, that the full weight of his vulnerability became evident to all. The Sultan was bedridden more often than not, his once sharp mind clouded by fever. His body, once strong and regal, had become frail, and his once imposing figure was reduced to a figure of quiet suffering. The ruling power of the Ottoman Empire, held so delicately by Bayezid, was now vulnerable to those who would seize it. The question of succession was not new to the Ottoman court. Throughout history, brothers had fought for the throne, and this time would be no different. The sons of Bayezid, each vying for the throne, had long been poised for the inevitable clash that would determine the future of the empire. The death of Sultan Mehmed II, Bayezid's father, had set the stage for this moment. But it was only with Bayezid's incapacitation that the true battle for the empire would unfold. Among the Sultan's sons, the most ambitious and dangerous was Selim, the youngest and most ruthless. Where Bayezid sought peace, Selim was driven by the need for action. Selim had long harbored resentment toward his father's more peaceful reign, and his thirst for power and military conquest was well known. While Bayezid had been a ruler of thought, Selim was a man of action, a soldier who believed in seizing what was rightfully his. As the Sultan's health deteriorated, Selim saw his opportunity. He knew that the moment for him to claim the throne had come. His supporters, generals, military leaders, and key figures from the palace, had been building power for years. Selim had won over the loyalty of the military and those in positions of authority. His ambition was clear, and his actions spoke louder than words. He was ready to overthrow his father and take the throne by force if necessary. Nigar Hatun watched this rising tide of ambition with growing alarm. Selim's eyes were set on the throne, and she knew that her son Korkut, who was more focused on governance and diplomacy, had little chance against the violent ambitions of his brother. Nigar had always known that the Ottoman Empire was a place where the strongest survived. But watching the events unfold was like watching a storm gather on the horizon, inevitable and terrifying. Korkut, raised in Manisa far from the power struggles of the capital, had always believed in the strength of his ideas, not the strength of his sword. He had never wanted the throne for himself. He believed that his father's approach to governance, peaceful and diplomatic, was the path to a better empire. He was a man of ideas, of compassion, of understanding. But those traits, Nigar knew, were not enough in this game. The empire was on the brink of chaos, and Selim was ready to do whatever it took to secure his place at the top. The rumors of Bayezid's condition spread quickly throughout the court. The palace was in a state of chaos. As the various factions began to position themselves, Selim's supporters began to mobilize. And it wasn't long before the first whispers of treason began to circulate. In the shadow of Bayezid's weakening condition, Selim made his move. The night was silent, the only sounds the soft rustle of the wind through the palace gardens and the occasional crackle of a distant flame. Nigar Hatun, ever watchful, felt the tension in the air. She had seen this before. The quiet before the storm. She had heard the whispers, seen the shifting allegiances. She knew that Selim's move was coming. She had spent years trying to protect her son, Korkut, but now the situation was beyond anyone's control. The palace doors opened, and the familiar faces of Selim's men entered the Sultan's chambers. Selim himself was nowhere to be seen. But his loyalists had moved quickly. They had seized control of the palace guards, ensuring that Bayezid's personal protection was now in the hands of his enemies. Nigar knew that this was the moment. She had to act swiftly. Inside the royal chambers, Bayezid lay in his bed, his face pale and tired. His once powerful presence was now diminished, his body frail, his eyes clouded by illness. Selim's supporters moved quickly, knowing that the moment Bayezid passed, Selim would be crowned sultan. Nigar, desperate to protect Korkut, rushed to Bayezid's bedside. Her heart broke as she looked at the man who had once been her protector. Her love, now so fragile. Bayezid was slipping away, and with him, any hope of securing the throne for Korkut. It was then that the door creaked open, and Selim entered. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. He knew what was happening. He had orchestrated it all. Selim had planned to take the throne long before his father's death. And now the final step was upon him. "Mother," Selim said, his voice low and calm. "It is done. The throne is mine now. The empire will be mine." Nigar's heart raced as she met his gaze. She knew that Selim had never cared for his father's reign, nor for his older brothers. He had wanted this moment for years. She had known it was coming. But now that it was here, the reality was more crushing than she had ever imagined. She looked at Bayezid, who was barely conscious, his life slipping away. Her heart ached with the weight of the moment. Her husband was dying, and with him, all hopes for the future of her son. But Korkut had no place in Selim's vision of the empire. "You will kill him, won't you?" Nigar's voice trembled, but she held her ground. Selim's gaze did not falter. "It is inevitable, mother. His time is over. The empire needs a sultan who can lead with strength. Korkut will never be that man." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Nigar's thoughts raced. She had protected Korkut for so long, had placed him in a position to rise above the chaos of the court. But now it seemed like all was lost. "You've already decided this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Then what of Korkut? What will happen to him?" "He will be dealt with, just like all the other threats," Selim said, coldly. "It is the way of the world." "Mother." Nigar's heart shattered. Her son's fate had been sealed. Selim had no mercy, no compassion. He would stop at nothing to secure his rule. With Bayezid's death and Selim's rise, the world of the Ottoman Empire had shifted forever. The empire would be ruled by a man who saw power as the only path to security. A man who believed in the strength of the sword rather than the wisdom of the heart. And for Korkut, the gentle and thoughtful prince who had once been his father's hope for a peaceful future, it seemed there was only one road left: exile, or death. As the final breath of Sultan Bayezid II escaped his lips, Nigar Hatun's world crumbled. She had lost her love, and now she had lost her son's future. The storm had arrived, and it was Selim's empire now, one built on blood, betrayal, and the strength of ambition. The death of Bayezid II was a somber moment, but for Selim, it was a moment of triumph. The years of careful maneuvering, the silent plotting behind closed doors, and the alliances he had forged had all led to this. Now, as Selim I, he stood at the threshold of power, ready to rule the vast Ottoman Empire that stretched from the gates of Europe to the deserts of Arabia. His reign, though it had started with the death of his father, was about to unfold in a way that would leave a legacy of fear, strength, and ruthlessness. In the imperial palace, The corridors once filled with the whispers of courtly life now carried an oppressive silence. The Sultan was dead, and the world was shifting. Selim's supporters were already at work, securing his position, ensuring that no one would challenge his claim to the throne. The army, which had long admired him for his military prowess, swore allegiance to the new sultan. Selim's reign would be defined not by diplomacy, as his fathers had, but by action, power, and conquest. But Selim's rise had not been without opposition. There were still many within the empire who held loyalty to Şehzade Korkut, his older brother, who had been seen as the more intellectual and peaceful heir. Korkut's death, though it had been executed with ruthless efficiency by Selim's supporters, had not gone unnoticed. The whispers of betrayal and fratricide filled the air, and yet, Selim had never been one to care for the opinions of others. He believed that power was earned through blood, and now that the blood had been shed, there was nothing left to do but claim his rightful place. Selim's vision for the empire was clear. He believed that the Ottoman throne could only be maintained by strength, not weakness. Bayezid's reign, with its focus on peace and diplomacy, had left the empire vulnerable to external threats. The military leaders, the generals who had supported Selim for years, were all eager for the conquest that would follow. Selim's mind was fixed on expanding the empire, not just preserving it. He sought to bring the Mamluks into submission, to conquer the Persian Safavids, and to extend Ottoman power deep into the heart of Europe. To him, the empire had been too soft under his father. He would bring it to its former glory with an iron fist. But this drive for expansion, for military conquest, was not without its costs. Selim's actions were not merely about securing the throne, they were about shaping the future of the empire. His brutal campaigns had earned him the moniker, Selim the Grim, a title that would follow him throughout his reign. Where his father had been respected for his wisdom and diplomatic skill, Selim was feared for his ruthlessness and his ability to carry out his will without hesitation. As the weeks passed, Selim solidified his control over the empire. His first order of business was to purge any remaining opposition to his rule. Bayezid's former supporters, those who had once sworn loyalty to his father's vision, found themselves in peril. Some were executed outright, others were imprisoned, and still more were sent into exile. The court had become a place of tension, where loyalty to the new sultan was rewarded with wealth and power, but treachery was met with swift and brutal punishment. In this climate of fear, Nigar Hatun, who had once been the trusted confidant of Bayezid II, now found herself caught between the lines of loyalty and the looming shadow of her son's death. She had never trusted Selim. His ambition, his thirst for power, had always been too dangerous. Yet she had been forced to watch as he had claimed the throne, knowing that her own son's blood had paved the way for Selim's rise. Nigar had been exiled, far from the center of power, but her influence in the empire was not easily erased. She had spent years maneuvering within the Ottoman court, building alliances, and now she had to rely on those alliances to protect her survival. There was still a sense of loyalty to her and her late husband in parts of the empire. And Nigar knew that if she could reach the right people, she might still have the ability to shift the course of events. But in this new world under Selim's rule, nothing was certain. Despite the heavy air of treachery and fear in the palace, there were still those who resisted Selim's rise. Korkut's followers, although defeated, still believed in his vision for the empire. Some of them quietly mourned the loss of the prince who had represented a future of peace and prosperity, not war and bloodshed. Nigar found herself meeting with some of these people in secret, hoping to find a way to fight back against the grip that Selim had placed on the empire. Meanwhile, Selim continued his reign of terror, marching to the east to confront the Mamluks in Egypt, and to the west, where he engaged in a series of campaigns that would push the borders of the Ottoman Empire further than they had ever been before. His campaigns were marked by brutality, as he crushed any opposition with overwhelming force. Selim the Grim became a name feared across the empire, and it was soon clear to all that the Ottoman Empire would never be the same under his rule. For Nigar Hatun, the battle was no longer one of political strategy, it was one of survival. Her influence had been diminished. Her son was gone, and the world she had known under Bayezid was slipping away. But Nigar had never been one to surrender. She had lost much, her husband, her son, her position in the palace, but she still had one thing left, her will. If she could not save Korkut, if she could not reclaim the throne for her family, she would at least survive the storm that Selim had unleashed. Yet, deep in her heart, Nigar knew that the empire was no longer the place of peace and wisdom that Bayezid had envisioned. Selim's reign was one of blood, a reign of conquest and ruthlessness. And as the empire expanded, so too did the shadows cast by Selim the Grim, a sultan who would stop at nothing to build his empire, no matter the cost. In the court of Selim, where the strong thrived and the weak perished, Nigar had learned one thing above all: to survive was to adapt. And she would do whatever it took to survive, even if it meant becoming part of the very game that had destroyed her family. In the weeks following the rise of Selim I, the empire grew more divided, its once stable foundations now tremoring under the weight of ambition, bloodshed, and betrayal. The Ottoman court was no longer a place of governance, it had become a battlefield, where loyalty was purchased with silver or secured through threats. Şehzade Korkut, exiled to the distant province of Manisa, was far from the epicenter of this conflict, but he could feel the storm brewing. Even from afar, his mind, ever sharp and thoughtful, could not ignore the whispers that reached him from the capital. The betrayal of his father and the swift execution of his supporters sent ripples of dread throughout the empire. And the tension in the air was palpable. Korkut had been a man of peace, of ideas, and of understanding. His inclination toward governance rather than warfare had shaped his character from a young age. He had been taught the values of wisdom and compassion, believing that a ruler should seek to protect and guide his people, not conquer or dominate them. But as Selim solidified his reign, Korkut knew, deep down, that the time for diplomatic ideals was over. The game of succession had evolved into one of survival, and for him, survival meant preparing for the inevitable clash with his brother. The first signs of trouble arrived quietly, in the form of secret letters and covert messages delivered to his court in Manisa. It was not just the occasional visit from a trusted ally or an envoy from the capital. It was the growing rumor that Selim's victory would not remain uncontested. Korkut, despite being an outsider to the courtly intrigues, was not blind to the threat looming over him. His own life, and the future of the empire, depended on whether or not he could hold on to what little power he had left. The days of peace and scholarly pursuits in Manisa were fading. The walls of the palace, which had once served as his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Korkut had been a ruler in name, but Selim, with his military alliances and ruthless tactics, had proven that power was taken, not given. His quiet days were over. Manisa, which had been his haven, now became the heart of his last stand. Nigar Hatun, now far removed from the palace, had begun to piece together a network of loyalists who still supported Korkut. Her grief over Bayezid's death had turned into a quiet resolve, and she set about ensuring that her son's claim to the throne was not forgotten. The world that had once been hers, full of promises, alliances, and quiet power, was now shadowed by the reality of Selim's brutal rise. Nigar knew that her son's survival depended on his ability to gather strength from the remnants of Bayezid's allies. She reached out to trusted officials, military leaders, and even remnants of the intellectual class who had once supported Korkut's vision for the empire. But time was not on their side. Selim had already begun moving to consolidate his power. His military forces were vast and well prepared. He had the support of the Janissaries, the elite soldiers who had pledged loyalty to him. Selim's forces were like a flood, unstoppable, moving to sweep away any remnants of opposition. Korkut's only hope was to remain hidden and to wait for an opportunity to act, but in the face of such overwhelming force, the chances of success were slim. Korkut's final stand began when his spies brought word that Selim's forces had been sighted at the borders of Manisa, moving in swift formation, headed directly toward his province. The time for hiding was over. The time for action had come. It was a choice between fight or flee. But Korkut was not one to flee. His principles, his deep-rooted belief in the peaceful governance his father had espoused, had long been tested. He was not the warrior Selim was. But he would not allow his family's vision of the empire to be erased by Selim's thirst for power. Korkut gathered his closest allies, those who still remained loyal to him, and began preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He was vastly outnumbered, and his forces were no match for the full might of Selim's military machine. But Korkut had something that Selim lacked: the heart of the people. He had been a ruler who understood the needs of the common people, who had spent years administering with fairness and respect. The governors of surrounding provinces, those who had not yet pledged their allegiance to Selim, were still sympathetic to his cause. The townspeople, those who had benefited from Korkut's policies, sent word that they were prepared to stand by him, offering their support in whatever form they could. As the troops of Selim advanced on Manisa, Korkut stood on the steps of his palace, looking out over the expansive horizon. The city that had once been his home was now surrounded by enemy forces. His supporters, though few, were ready to fight, to defend what was rightfully his. Korkut's mind raced as he prepared for the final battle. He had always believed that peace was the true power of a ruler. But in the face of such overwhelming odds, he now understood that sometimes, even the most peaceful man must fight. The battle, when it came, was swift and brutal. Korkut's forces, though determined, were simply outmatched by the trained, battle-hardened soldiers of Selim. The conflict was inevitable, but the outcome was never in doubt. Korkut's forces were defeated. His soldiers were overwhelmed, their numbers too small to stand against Selim's might. As the battle raged on, Korkut was forced to make the ultimate decision: to surrender and face the consequences of his rebellion, or to flee into exile, where he would live out the remainder of his days in hiding, away from the empire he had once believed in so deeply. Korkut chose to surrender. It was not because he feared Selim, but because he knew the cost of further bloodshed would be too great. The people of Manisa had already suffered enough, and his rebellion, no matter how noble in its intent, had only served to divide the empire further. He knew that there was no place for him in Selim's world, a world built on conquest, not peace. As Korkut was captured and taken before Selim, the bitterness of defeat settled in his heart. He had fought for a future that now seemed lost. But he did not give up. He would not go quietly into the night. He would speak his final words to his brother. And perhaps, in those words, he could still plant the seeds of the future he had dreamed of, a future of peace. Not bloodshed. But as he looked into the cold eyes of Selim the Grim, he knew that his fight was over. The Ottoman Empire had changed forever, and Korkut's vision would never come to pass. The day Şehzade Korkut was captured was a day that would echo through the history of the Ottoman Empire. A day that would mark the fall of a prince who embodied the ideals of peace and wisdom in a world where strength and ruthlessness triumphed. For Nigar Hatun, his mother, it was a moment that shattered the final remnants of hope she had held onto. When word reached her of Korkut's capture, the weight of despair fell heavily on her heart. The son she had fought so hard to protect, the son who had carried the dreams of a peaceful empire within him, had been defeated. Her world, which had already been rocked by the death of her husband, Bayezid II, now seemed to crumble around her. Selim's victory had sealed the fate of her family. Bayezid's peaceful vision had been erased. And now Korkut's life hung by a fragile thread. Nigar was far from the capital, exiled to a remote palace on the outskirts of the empire. In her isolation, she had been relying on the flickers of hope from those who remained loyal to her family. But with Korkut's capture, she knew that no more help could come. Selim had triumphed, and in the eyes of the new sultan, there was no place for anyone who dared to challenge him. In the silence of her chambers, Nigar's mind raced as she thought of the young prince, her son, who had stood so firm in his beliefs. He had chosen surrender over further bloodshed. But the empire that he had tried to protect now stood under the rule of a man who saw only power as the path to stability. The thought of Selim's cruelty, his iron fist and his thirst for domination, was almost too much to bear. Yet, Nigar knew that the worst was yet to come. Her son's fate would not be determined by mercy or understanding. Selim the Grim, whose ambition had eclipsed any shred of compassion, would make sure that Korkut's final moments were a reminder to the world that there was no room for weakness in the new Ottoman order. But Korkut's capture did not just signal the end of her son's future. It marked the death of her own identity in the court. Once, she had been a trusted advisor. A woman who had wielded influence and worked behind the scenes to secure a future for her family. Now, she was just a mother. Powerless, watching as the dreams she had built for her children were ground to dust under Selim's ascension. The news of Korkut's imprisonment reached her late one evening. A lone messenger, his face drawn with grief, had arrived at her palace with the fateful words. There had been no battle cry, no final stand, just the quiet capture of a prince who had once been seen as a beacon of hope. The message was clear: Selim had won. And Korkut's defiance had been silenced. Nigar sank to her knees as the news settled in. Her heart ached with the loss of her son. Not just physically, but ideologically. Korkut had believed in a different path for the empire, one of compassion and justice. A path that was now forever shut by the harsh rule of his brother. Selim had been the embodiment of power through force. His vision of the Ottoman Empire was one of conquest, domination, and submission. There was no room for the peaceful governance that Korkut had dreamed of. The empire would bend to Selim's will, and all those who were not willing to bend would be broken. In the isolation of her exile, Nigar felt the crushing weight of her helplessness. Korkut's life was no longer in her hands. She could no longer protect him, no longer shield him from the storm that had engulfed the empire. And as her mind turned to the inevitable fate that awaited her son, Nigar knew one thing: she had to act. She had no illusions about the possibility of saving Korkut now. But as a mother, her heart would not allow her to stand idly by. There had to be something. Some last attempt to ensure that her son's name would not be erased from history by the darkness of Selim's rule. She would have to rely on the loyalty of those who had once served her family, those who had believed in Bayezid's vision for a better future. Nigar Hatun had no power left in the palace. But she still had her influence among the remnants of Bayezid's loyalists. She sent secret letters, asking for aid, for rescue, for any opportunity to give Korkut a chance to escape before Selim's wrath was fully unleashed. But as the hours passed, her hopes dwindled. The prison of Selim's empire was not one that could be broken by mere requests or alliances. Korkut's fate was sealed, and the final blow would come swiftly. In the capital, Selim prepared to deal with his brother's rebellion once and for all. Though Korkut had surrendered, Selim's bloodlust knew no bounds. He could not allow a potential threat to the throne to remain alive. No matter how peaceful or innocent the claimant, Korkut's mere existence was a symbol of a different path for the empire. One that was now dead in the eyes of the new sultan. Korkut's execution was swift. The bowstring, the traditional method of royal execution, was used to silence the last of Bayezid's line. He had been a prince who could have shaped the future of the empire in a gentler, more just way. But in Selim's world, such ideas were weak and treasonous. His body, once a symbol of hope for a different Ottoman future, was now just another lifeless form in the wake of Selim's ascension. As Nigar received the final word of her son's death, the pain of loss was more than she could bear. She had already lost her husband, and now she had lost Korkut. The dreams of a peaceful, compassionate empire were gone, and in their place stood the brutal reality of Selim's rule. Nigar Hatun, now completely alone, had lost everything: her husband, her son, her place in the court. All were consumed by the fire of ambition that had been lit by Selim. And though she had no power left, Nigar vowed that the memory of Korkut would not be lost. The world might be changing, but the legacy of her son, the dream of a more just and peaceful empire, would live on in the hearts of those who had believed in him. And perhaps, in time, that dream would be reborn, even if it had to wait for another era to come. But for now, Nigar Hatun could only mourn. The empire had been claimed by blood, and her family's vision was no more. The storm had taken everything she loved, and only the cold silence of the palace remained in the wake of the devastation. In the heart of the capital, where once Bayezid II's peaceful vision had thrived, the air had grown thick with the suffocating presence of Selim's rule. The city, once a place of cultural flourishing, now seemed overshadowed by the harsh reality of a sultan who ruled with fear. The walls of the palace, which had echoed with the voices of statesmen and philosophers under Bayezid's reign, now reverberated only with the heavy footsteps of soldiers and the grim whispers of court conspiracies. For Nigar Hatun, the moment of her son's execution was like the final stroke of a devastating storm. Her son, Şehzade Korkut, who had once carried the promise of a more peaceful, just empire, was no more. His death marked the end of an era, and the destruction of the dreams she and her late husband had fought for. She had already lost so much: the death of Bayezid, the disintegration of their shared vision for the empire, and now the loss of her son, whose life had been snuffed out by the very brother he had once hoped would share the throne with him. As she received the news of Korkut's death, the coldness of it was overwhelming. Selim the Grim had wasted no time. In his ruthless desire to consolidate his power, Korkut had become yet another casualty in the ever-turning machine of Ottoman succession. The manner of his death, swift and brutal, the bowstring, the traditional method of royal executions, was both a confirmation of his brother's absolute power and a testament to Selim's cruelty. Nigar, though physically distant from the capital, felt the weight of her son's demise as though it had shattered her soul. The vision she had worked so tirelessly to preserve had died with him. Korkut's compassionate rule, his ideas for a better, more harmonious empire, were no longer part of the Ottoman legacy. Selim's vision, one of conquest and strength, would now dominate the empire for generations to come. The palace was silent in the days following Korkut's death. Nigar had heard nothing of the events, of the specific details. But she could imagine the scene clearly. Selim's forces, those loyal to him, had most certainly surrounded Korkut, forcing him into submission. The finality of the moment, Korkut's inevitable defeat, seemed almost too much to bear. He had been captured, held prisoner, and then silenced, just as many of his predecessors had been. But Korkut had never been a man of violence. He had chosen peace, even when the throne he was destined to inherit was so fiercely contested. In the isolated chambers of her palace, Nigar could hear the distant sound of the waves crashing against the shore. The Bosphorus, which had once connected two worlds, Europe and Asia, now seemed like a cruel reminder of her son's absence. He had believed, so deeply, in the idea that rulers should serve their people, not conquer them. But in Selim's world, Korkut's ideas had no place. Her thoughts drifted back to when she had first come to the palace. To when she had met Bayezid, the man she had loved with all her heart. Bayezid had shared her vision, and together, they had raised their sons with the hope that the Ottoman Empire would one day be led by reason, peace, and wisdom. But now, the empire was teetering on the edge of totalitarianism, controlled by a sultan who believed only in power. Korkut had tried so hard to protect that vision. He had governed with a gentle hand, seeking to understand the needs of the people, but his refusal to embrace the brutality of war had sealed his fate. His actions had been misunderstood, even seen as weak in a world that valued strength above all else. Korkut had known his time was running out, but he had refused to abandon his principles. He had believed in the future, in the power of good governance. But ultimately, Selim's empire could not allow such ideals to flourish. The empire needed a sultan who was willing to crush his enemies, to expand the borders of the realm, and to maintain control at any cost. Korkut had been a man who believed that peace could be won by understanding, by dialogue, not through the endless bloodshed that had defined Ottoman rule for centuries. But now, the blood of his family had stained the very empire that they had tried to build. Nigar had learned, over the years, to hold her tongue. She had been a woman of power, a woman who had once been at the heart of courtly politics, advising Bayezid and protecting their family's interests. But now, with Korkut gone, there was nothing left for her to protect. Her son had been killed, her husband had died, and the empire that they had all believed in was shattered. Korkut's death was not just the loss of a son, it was the loss of an entire vision, the dream of a peaceful, just empire where rulers governed with wisdom, where the bloodshed of wars did not shape the destiny of the people. Now, the empire was under the iron rule of Selim, and any hope of peace seemed like a distant memory. The path Korkut had chosen was now gone, erased by the man who believed only in the power of the sword. Nigar's grief was compounded by guilt, the guilt of having failed her son. The guilt of not being able to protect him from the Empire's unforgiving grip. She had raised Korkut to be a ruler who would shape the world differently. But in the end, the world had shaped him instead. Selim's ambition had consumed everything in its path, including the last spark of hope that had resided in Şehzade Korkut. But as the days passed, something in Nigar began to shift. She could not, would not, allow her son's death to be the final word on the future of the empire. Korkut's legacy, though his life was gone, had not been extinguished. It lived in the hearts of those who had believed in his vision for a better Ottoman Empire. Nigar knew that she had one final duty: to ensure that Korkut's memory was not lost to the annals of history. The world might be ruled by Selim now, but she would find a way to keep the dream of peace alive, even if it meant living the rest of her days in shadow. The death of her son had stolen much from her, but it had not stolen her will to fight. The empire might be under Selim's rule, but there were still people who believed in the vision Korkut had held. Nigar would find them, protect them, and keep the flame of her son's dream alive, no matter the cost. For as long as she lived, she would ensure that Korkut's legacy was not just the tragic end of a prince, but a beginning. The death of Şehzade Korkut sent a ripple of despair through the remnants of Bayezid II's loyalists. For many, Korkut had represented the last vestige of a future where peace and compassion might yet have a place in the Ottoman Empire. But now, with Korkut gone and Selim firmly in control, there was little left to hold onto, except perhaps memories and the faint hope that the empire's tides would one day turn. For Nigar Hatun, the world she had once known, full of political intrigue, diplomacy, and love for her family, was now unrecognizable. The palace that had once been her home, where she had moved with grace and power, was now a place of cold shadows. She had been the woman who had stood by Bayezid's side, offering him counsel, weaving alliances, and ensuring the family's survival. But that was all in the past now. Selim's rule had obliterated all traces of the old order. Exile was not something Nigar had ever imagined for herself. She had been the Haseki Sultan, Bayezid's most trusted wife, his closest confidant. But now, in the wake of Korkut's death and Selim's ruthless rise to power, she had been relegated to a silent corner of the empire, far from the heart of power. Her title, once a symbol of influence and respect, had become nothing more than a faint memory. In the remote palace where she had been banished, Nigar was forced to reflect on the choices that had brought her to this place of solitude. The life she had once known, filled with strategic meetings, carefully crafted alliances, and the shared dream of a peaceful Ottoman Empire, was now lost. She had thought she was protecting her family, that her son Korkut's reign would change the future of the empire. But Selim's ambition had crushed everything. The peace that Bayezid had envisioned was gone, and with Korkut's death, Nigar's hope for a more just and benevolent rule had perished as well. The walls of the palace she now resided in were cold and high, keeping the outside world at bay. Her servants were few, their eyes wary of the former queen. She had once been a figure of grandeur, but now she was a woman living in the shadows, forgotten by most, abandoned by all except for a small circle of loyalists who still believed in her vision for the empire. Her son's death had sealed her fate. Her influence was no longer needed. And Selim had no use for the woman who had once been his mother's most trusted confidant. But exile had not taken away her strength. Nigar Hatun, despite her grief and isolation, refused to let her legacy vanish without a trace. She was a mother, and mothers never forget. She would not allow the memory of Korkut to fade into the darkness. Nor would she let the vision of a better empire die with him. The power she had once wielded, though now distant, was still within her, and in the silence of her exile, she began to plan her next move. The empire may have been under Selim's control, but there were still whispers in the wind, voices in the shadows, who held onto the belief that the Ottoman Empire could be something better, something just. And as long as there were those who remembered Bayezid's reign, who remembered Korkut's dreams, Nigar knew she could keep the light of hope alive. She began writing letters, secret messages sent to trusted allies, those who had served Bayezid and remained loyal to Korkut's cause. The empire, Nigar knew, was a massive machine, and like all machines, it had its cracks, its weaknesses. If she could find those cracks, she could work from within. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about ensuring that Korkut's dream, the dream of a peaceful and compassionate empire, would live on. She did not expect to return to the capital, nor did she expect Selim's reign to crumble. But Nigar knew that there would come a time when the people would remember the past, when they would long for the balance and wisdom that Bayezid had offered. The empire was strong under Selim's rule, but power built on fear was fragile. Revolts, uprisings, and discontent were the inevitable consequences of such a harsh regime. Nigar believed that one day, the empire would need a ruler who would look beyond conquest and bloodshed. She believed that the time for her son's vision would come again, perhaps not in her lifetime. But the seed had been planted. Her influence in the court might have been erased. But in exile, Nigar Hatun had become something more. She was now a symbol of resistance. A mother who had lost everything but would never forget the vision of peace that had once guided the empire. Though she had no army to command, no position of power to fall back on, Nigar knew she still had the most potent weapon in the world: hope. And so, as the years passed and Selim's empire continued to expand, Nigar's life in exile continued. She lived in the quiet, secluded from the grand machinations of the palace, but never far from the pulse of the empire she had once been part of. The letters she wrote to those still loyal to her family's cause never stopped. The name of Şehzade Korkut, the prince who had represented the possibility of a better world, remained alive in those circles. His death had not been the end of his legacy. In the silence of exile, Nigar vowed that it would never be forgotten. And so, with a mother's determination, she continued to wait. She knew that, though Selim ruled with an iron fist today, the future of the Ottoman Empire could still be shaped by the ideals that Korkut had embodied, a future of peace, justice, and benevolence. Nigar Hatun's exile was not the end. It was only the beginning of a quiet revolution that would continue long after her days in the shadows had passed. Years passed slowly for Nigar Hatun. The once brilliant halls of the Ottoman court, full of whispers and the bustling voices of courtiers, were now mere memories to her. In exile, far from the center of power, she was a shadow of the woman who had once commanded the admiration and respect of the empire. Yet, despite the crushing weight of her losses, her husband, her son, and the dreams she had held dear, Nigar never surrendered to despair. Her life had been stripped of its grandeur, but it was not devoid of purpose. Each passing day, as the empire under Selim I's iron rule grew stronger, Nigar's resolve only deepened. She had no armies, no political office, but what she did have was her undying belief in the vision of peace and wisdom that had once been shared by her late husband and son. In her exile, Nigar Hatun transformed into something new. She became the keeper of a legacy, a symbol of everything the empire could have been but failed to be under Selim's ruthless reign. Nigar spent her days writing letters in secret, sending them to trusted allies, to those who had once served Bayezid II, to those who had believed in the possibility of peaceful rule. She did not expect an immediate uprising, nor did she dream of returning to the capital to claim a throne for her son. She knew that such dreams were no longer realistic. But in those quiet letters, which spoke of Korkut's ideals, of Bayezid's vision, she planted the seed of a silent revolution, a revolution that would one day awaken in the hearts of those who longed for a different path for the empire. It was not about the immediate overthrow of Selim. No, Nigar knew that power built on fear and blood had a way of entrenching itself. But the empires built by such rulers often crumble under the weight of their own oppression. The people who had once rejoiced in Bayezid's peace and Korkut's compassion would not forget. One day, they would remember, and the legacy of her family, the legacy of peace, would rise again. The world was moving on, but the Ottoman Empire, under Selim's rule, was now fractured by its own internal contradictions. His military conquests, his ruthless rule, had brought the empire vast territories, but at a steep price. Selim's reign was marked by fear and oppression, and though he could claim victory after victory, he could never claim the hearts of his people. Unlike Bayezid, who had been loved by his subjects, Selim was feared, respected, but never loved. Nigar saw this as the cracks in the empire's foundation. She began to hear murmurs from the people, the voices of those who had once embraced Korkut's ideals, who had believed in the promise of a more just and benevolent empire, were beginning to rise again. They had seen what Selim had done, and they had begun to question whether the bloody rule of his reign could truly secure the empire for future generations. As the years wore on, Nigar became a figure of quiet defiance, not an active rebel, but a symbol of a better way. Her exile, far from silencing her, had allowed her to quietly pass on her son's vision of peace to those who would listen. Every letter she sent, every whispered conversation with the few loyalists who still supported Bayezid's memory, was a step toward building a future in which Korkut's dream would not be forgotten. Despite the oppression of the times, a small but growing movement began to take shape, particularly among the intellectuals, the military officers, and the governors who had once stood by Bayezid. These were the men and women who had seen firsthand what Selim's vision had cost them. They had seen how Selim's thirst for power had destroyed families, crushed alliances, and left the empire stretched thin by endless war. They began to ask themselves, was this truly the future they wanted for the empire? Or could the world be shaped differently? Could it be shaped by the ideals that had once driven Bayezid and Korkut? The shift was slow, so slow that it was barely perceptible to anyone outside the inner circles of power. But Nigar Hatun's influence had not died with her son. It lived in the hearts of those who had been touched by Bayezid's rule, by Korkut's gentle wisdom, and who saw in the current state of the empire only destruction and division. These people began to whisper, in the halls of the palace and the streets of the city, about the possibility of a new empire, one where the sword would not always reign supreme, and where the rule of law and justice could return. Selim's reign, though it had been built on the power of military conquest, had proven to be unsustainable. The empire, despite its victories, had become a machine of constant war, and the people, although initially cowed by his strength, were beginning to see the cracks in the facade. They had begun to wonder whether they could live in an empire where the brutality of war was never ending, where peace was always an afterthought. And so, as the decades passed, Nigar remained in her exile. But she knew one thing for certain: the empire she had once dreamed of, the one her husband and son had tried to create, would return. It would not come in her time, perhaps, and not under Selim's reign, but the seed of hope that Korkut had planted would one day take root. The Ottoman Empire, broken by years of conquest, would eventually seek a new path, a path toward peace, wisdom, and justice. Nigar, in her quiet exile, became a guardian of that hope, passing it on to those few who still believed in it. Her legacy, now that of a silent rebel, lived on in the hearts of those who remembered a time when the Ottoman Empire had been more than just a machine of war. It had been a dream that one day, perhaps, would be reborn. And so, Nigar Hatun lived on, not in power, but in spirit, guarding the legacy of her son and her husband, waiting for the day when the empire might once again embrace the dream of peace they had all once fought for. Time marched on, as it always does, indifferent to the struggles of individuals, to the rise and fall of empires, and to the dreams of those who dared to challenge the world as it was. The Ottoman Empire, under Selim the Grim, continued to expand, and his name became synonymous with both the terror of his rule and the immense power he wielded. Military victories piled upon one another, and the empire flourished on the outside. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a tension, a sense that all the conquest in the world could not silence the longing for peace, for something more than the endless cycles of war. Nigar Hatun, now an old woman, sat by the window of her exile, looking out over the same waters she had once admired with Bayezid at her side. The Bosphorus still shimmered beneath the pale sky, but it seemed a world away from the once vibrant life she had known. Her son, Korkut, was gone, as was Bayezid, and the empire had passed from the hands of her family into the cold grasp of Selim's ambition. Yet in her heart, the memory of their vision, of a world where rulers would govern with compassion and justice, had not faltered. The world outside had changed. Selim's empire was not the same as her husband's had been, nor could it ever be. Bayezid's ideals of peace and wisdom had been replaced by the ruthless conquest that had brought the empire into an era of unprecedented military dominance. But the cost of such dominance was evident. The land was tired. The people worn thin by endless wars. The unity of the empire threatened by the ever-present specter of discontent. Though Nigar had no power left, she did not sit idly by. In the silence of her exile, she found a new strength. She wrote. She counseled those who still believed in the ideals she had shared with Bayezid and Korkut. In the shadows of history, she was still a quiet force, reminding those who would listen of the past. Her letters, though never sent to the capital, reached the hands of the few who had not forgotten Bayezid's reign. They whispered of a future that was yet to come, one where the dream of peace would once again rise from the ashes of war. Though the world around her was filled with blood and conquest, Nigar never gave up on the hope that one day, the Ottoman Empire would return to its roots, when rulers would lead not with the sword, but with wisdom and justice. In her heart, she believed that the seed planted by Korkut had not been fully extinguished. The empire, no matter how powerful or vast, would one day feel the weight of its own brutality, and in that moment, it would seek the peace that had once been so firmly planted in its foundation. Years passed. The empire continued to expand under Selim, and the world moved on. But as time wore on, those who had once been the followers of Korkut's vision, the scholars, the intellectuals, the generals who had been loyal to Bayezid's memory, began to speak once again. In the taverns, in the marketplaces, and in the quiet corners of the city, there were murmurs of change. The cycle of power, built on conquest and fear, was beginning to wear thin. The people had begun to yearn for something more, something different. They whispered about the possibility of a return to the peaceful ideals that had once been the core of their empire. Nigar, though aged and fragile, was there to witness this quiet transformation. Her influence, though never seen in the light of day, had slowly begun to ripple through the empire. Her letters, her words, and the memories of Korkut's gentle rule remained alive in the hearts of those who still believed. And though she had been exiled, silenced by the politics of the palace, Nigar Hatun had been a part of something greater than herself. As she lay in her final years, the quiet realization began to settle in her heart. The empire had not forgotten the ideas that she and her family had sacrificed so much for. The dream of a peaceful Ottoman Empire had not been wiped away. They had endured, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Selim the Grim had ruled with fear, and in his wake, he had built a legacy of war and conquest. But Korkut's dream, the dream of a better, more just empire, had not died. It had only slumbered, waiting for a time when the empire would seek the kind of leadership that Korkut had embodied. And when that time came, Nigar Hatun's vision, though silent for so many years, would be reborn. In her final moments, as the Bosphorus glistened outside her window, Nigar's heart was at peace. She had done all she could. The memory of her family, of Bayezid, and Korkut, would never fade. The empire would one day be guided by the ideals they had fought for. And so, as the world shifted around her, Nigar Hatun closed her eyes, knowing that the legacy of peace, though it had been long buried under the weight of conquest and power, would one day rise again. And with that, the story of Nigar Hatun, a mother, a wife, a dreamer, ended. Her legacy, though invisible to many, would remain alive in the hearts of those who still believe that a ruler should be wise, just, and compassionate, a ruler who governed with the people in mind, not with the sword. The empire had not forgotten her, not truly, and one day, the winds of change would bring the empire back to the dream she and her family had so long envisioned.